At my CEO's son's wedding, he ordered, "Take those ridiculous medals off your suit. You embarrass me." When I refused, he punched me in front of 300 guests. Then, a Navy SEAL grabbed his wrist and said 8 words that made the entire room go pale. "I'm glad to have you here." Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought my own son would be the one to break me. At 61 years old, I've survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, watched good men die beside me, and carried wounds that still ache when it rains. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened at Marvin's wedding. The Belmont Country Club sparkled like something out of a magazine that night. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over 300 of the city's elite, all dressed in their finest. I stood near the bar, adjusting my dress uniform one last time. The navy blue fabric felt familiar against my skin, and the weight of my medals on my chest filled me with quiet pride. I'd earned every single one of them through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. "Dad, what the hell are you wearing?" Marvin's voice cut through the gentle murmur of conversation like a blade. I turned to see my son striding toward me, his face twisted with something I'd never seen before, pure disgust. His new wife, Melissa, followed behind him, her designer dress swishing against the marble floor. "It's my dress uniform, son. I thought—" "You thought wrong." His words came out sharp, clipped. "This is my wedding, not some military parade." The conversations around us began to quiet. I could feel eyes turning our way, 300 guests suddenly very interested in our family drama. My chest tightened, but I kept my voice steady. "Marvin, these medals represent an embarrassment." He stepped closer. Close enough that I could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Look around, Dad. These are important people. CEOs, investors, politicians. They don't want to see some old soldier playing dress-up." The words hit me like shrapnel to the chest. Some old soldier, playing dress-up. I looked down at the bronze star pinned to my uniform, remembering the weight of Sergeant Martinez in my arms as I carried him to safety under enemy fire. The Purple Heart, earned when shrapnel tore through my shoulder during that same mission. These weren't costumes or props. They were pieces of my soul. "Son, I've worn this uniform to every important moment of your life. Your graduation, your promotion, and it was embarrassing then too." Marvin's voice rose, drawing more stares. "I've built something here, Dad. A reputation, a business. I can't have you making me look like some charity case whose daddy couldn't make it in the real world." Melissa placed a manicured hand on his arm. "Marvin, maybe we should—" "No." He shook her off, his eyes never leaving mine. "This ends now. Take off those ridiculous medals, Dad. Take them off, or I'll have security escort you out." The ballroom had gone completely silent now, 300 faces watching, waiting to see what would happen next. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but not from shame, from anger. Deep, burning anger that my own flesh and blood could stand there and strip away everything I'd fought for. "No," I said quietly. "What did you say?" I said, "No, Marvin. These medals stay where they are." His face darkened, the way it used to when he was a child and didn't get his way. But this wasn't a tantrum over a toy or extra television time. This was my son, a 32-year-old man, about to show 300 people exactly who he really was. "You stubborn old fool," he hissed. "You just can't stand that I made something of myself without your help, can you? You can't stand that I'm successful while you're just a washed-up has-been living on military pension." Each word felt like a physical blow. I thought about all the nights I'd worked double shifts at the base to pay for his college. The promotion I'd turned down because it would have meant missing his high school graduation. The countless sacrifices I'd made so he could have everything I never did. "Marvin," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I'm proud of what you've accomplished. I've always been proud of you. All I wanted was for you to be proud of me too." He laughed then, a sound so cold it made my blood freeze. "Proud of you? Dad, you're a 61-year-old man clinging to medals from wars nobody cares about anymore. You're pathetic." That's when he did it. That's when my son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike and helped with homework and loved more than my own life, drew back his fist and punched me square in the face. The sound echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. I stumbled backward, tasting blood, feeling my lips split against my teeth. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Someone screamed. But all I could do was stare at Marvin, at this stranger wearing my son's face, and wonder where I had gone so terribly wrong. "Security!" he shouted, straightening his tie as if nothing had happened. Remove this man from my wedding. Two men in black suits started moving toward me, but before they could reach me, a voice cut through the chaos like thunder. Nobody touches that man. I looked up through watery eyes to see someone pushing through the crowd. A tall man in an expensive suit, his face carved from granite, his eyes blazing with fury. Commander James Richardson, one of Marvin's biggest investors. I'd seen him at company events, but we'd never been introduced. Richardson reached us in 3 long strides and grabbed Marvin's wrist just as my son was raising his hand again. The grip was iron strong, the kind that comes from years of military training. You, Richardson said, his voice deadly calm, just made the biggest mistake of your miserable life. The silence that followed Richardson's words felt like the calm before an explosion. I touched my split lip with trembling fingers, the metallic taste of blood sharp on my tongue. Around us, 300 wedding guests stood frozen, champagne glasses halfway to their lips, their expressions ranging from shock to horror. But all I could think about was how we'd gotten here, how the little boy who used to polish my boots every Sunday morning had become this stranger who saw me as nothing more than an embarrassment. Richardson still held Marvin's wrist in that vice-like grip, his face a mask of controlled fury. My son's face had gone pale beneath his expensive tan, and for the first time since his tirade began, he looked uncertain. "Let go of me," Marvin said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Not until you apologize to this man," Richardson replied, his tone suggesting this wasn't a request. "Apologize? To him?" Marvin laughed, but it came out shaky. "Do you know who I am? I'm the CEO of—" "I know exactly who you are," Richardson cut him off. "What I don't think you know is who he is." I wanted to sink into the floor. All those years of keeping quiet about my service, of downplaying my achievements so Marvin wouldn't feel overshadowed, had led to this moment. He genuinely didn't know what those medals represented because I'd never told him the full story. My mind drifted back to another night, 15 years ago, when Marvin had brought his college girlfriend home for dinner. We'd been sitting around the kitchen table when she'd asked about my military service. Before I could answer, Marvin had jumped in with a dismissive laugh. "Oh, Dad was just a regular soldier. Nothing too exciting." I'd opened my mouth to correct him, to explain about the missions, the commendations, the lives saved. But then I'd seen the look in his eyes. Not malicious, just indifferent. Like my service was some minor detail in our family history. No more significant than where I'd gone to high school. So I'd smiled and changed the subject, thinking I was protecting his feelings, thinking it was better to be humble than to risk making him feel small. I'd been protecting him from the truth of who his father really was, and in doing so, I'd made myself invisible. The memory of another night crashed over me, Marvin's high school graduation. I'd been offered a promotion to Master Sergeant, which would have meant relocating to Fort Bragg for 6 months of advanced training. It was everything I'd worked toward for 20 years. But Marvin's graduation was the same week as the training program began. "Take the promotion, Dad," Marvin had said when I'd explained the conflict. "It's just a ceremony, I'll understand." But I'd heard the hurt underneath his casual tone. I'd heard how much it mattered to him, even if he couldn't say it directly. So I'd turned down the promotion, stayed for his graduation, and watched him walk across that stage with a pride that made my chest swell. He'd hugged me afterward, told me he was glad I'd stayed. For one perfect moment, I'd felt like I'd made the right choice. Now, standing in this ballroom with blood on my lip and shame burning in my chest, I wondered if he even remembered that graduation, if any of my sacrifices had mattered to him at all. "Sir, are you all right?" I blinked back to the present to find Richardson looking at me with genuine concern. Marvin had shaken free of his grip and was straightening his jacket, his face flushed with anger and what might have been fear. "I'm fine," I managed, though my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "No," Richardson said firmly. "You're not fine. And this," he gestured around the ballroom, "is not fine." Melissa tugged at Marvin's sleeve. "Baby, maybe we should just—" "Should just what?" Marvin snapped, turning his fury on his new wife. "Let some washed-up veteran ruin our wedding? This is supposed to be our special day, and he's making it all about himself with his pathetic attention-seeking." The words hit me like physical blows. Attention-seeking. That's what he thought this was, that I'd worn my dress uniform to steal his spotlight, to make his wedding about me instead of him. I thought about the morning I'd decided to wear the uniform. I'd stood in front of my bedroom mirror for 20 minutes, debating between my dress blues and the simple black suit hanging beside it. I'd chosen the uniform because I wanted to honor the occasion, to show respect for my son's big day. To look like someone he could be proud to call father. Instead, I'd given him a reason to be ashamed. "Marvin," I said quietly, my voice barely carrying over the whispered conversations that had started up around us. "I never meant to embarrass you. I just wanted—" "You wanted to show off," he cut me off. "You wanted everyone to look at you and think about your glory days because you can't stand that your own son is more successful than you ever were. More successful than I ever was." The words echoed in my head as I looked around the ballroom, taking in the marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the guests in their $1,000 suits and designer gowns. This was Marvin's world now, a world built on corporate achievements and financial victories, where success was measured in profit margins and stock prices. In this world, my 3 bronze stars, my Purple Heart, my combat action badge, they were just old pieces of metal, relics from a life that didn't matter anymore. But as I stood there, feeling smaller and more invisible than I ever had in my 61 years, I caught sight of something that made my blood freeze. Richardson's eyes had gone cold, deadly cold, and he was looking at Marvin like a predator, sizing up prey. "You really have no idea who your father is, do you?" Richardson asked, his voice so quiet I almost missed it. Marvin scoffed. "I know exactly who he is. He's Kenneth Walsh, retired Army, collects a pension and lives in a 1-bedroom apartment because he never learned how to make real money." Richardson's jaw tightened. "Your father is Sergeant Kenneth Walsh, Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart, and Combat Action Badge. And you, son, just committed the worst mistake of your privileged little life." Something in Richardson's tone made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. This wasn't just a stranger defending an old soldier. This was personal. Richardson knew something about my service that he shouldn't know, unless we'd met before, in a place where knowing such details was a matter of life and death. The way Richardson said my name, my rank, my decorations, it sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the ballroom. Bronze Star with V device. The words hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Very few people knew about the V device, the small bronze letter that indicated the medal was awarded specifically for valor in combat. It wasn't something you'd find in a casual Google search or a company background check. Marvin's confident smirk faltered slightly. "Look, Mr. Richardson, I appreciate you trying to defend my father, but—" "Defend him?" Richardson's laugh was sharp, dangerous. "Son, I'm not defending him. I'm trying to save you from making this any worse than it already is." The crowd around us had thickened. Word was spreading through the ballroom like wildfire, and more guests were pushing closer to see what was happening. I caught glimpses of shocked faces, heard whispered fragments of conversation. Did he really hit his own father? At his own wedding? Those are military medals. Who is that man with them? Richardson stepped closer to Marvin, and I noticed for the first time the way he moved, controlled, precise, like a weapon that had been honed to perfection. There was something familiar about his bearing, something that tugged at memories I'd tried to bury. "Your father," Richardson said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet ballroom, "is one of the finest soldiers I've ever had the honor of serving with." The words hit me like a physical force. Serving with, not serving under, not commanding, but serving with, as equals, as brothers in arms. And then it hit me. The jawline, the way he held his shoulders, the scar barely visible above his left eyebrow. 23 years older, wearing an expensive suit instead of combat gear, but the eyes were the same. Those steel gray eyes that had looked up at me from a stretcher in a field hospital in Kandahar. "Jimmy?" The name came out as barely a whisper. Richardson's head turned toward me, and when our eyes met, I saw the confirmation I'd been hoping for and dreading in equal measure. "Hello, Sarge," he said quietly. "It's been a long time." The nickname hit me like a punch to the gut. Sarge. That's what they'd all called me, the young Marines in my unit who'd looked to me for guidance, for protection, for a way home through the hell we'd all volunteered to walk into. Jimmy Richardson had been 19 years old when I'd first met him, fresh out of boot camp and scared out of his mind. A kid from Ohio who joined the Corps to pay for college and found himself in the middle of a war zone instead. I'd taken him under my wing, taught him how to stay alive, how to keep his head down and his eyes open. "You two know each other?" Marvin's voice cracked slightly on the words. Richardson never took his eyes off me. Your father saved my life, Marvin. Him and 22 other Marines. The ballroom went dead silent. 300 people holding their breath, waiting for a story they somehow knew would change everything. September 15th, 2001, Richardson continued, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone giving a military briefing. Forward operating base Charlie, 30 clicks outside Kandahar. We were supposed to be a routine patrol, check the perimeter, make contact with local village leaders, return to base before dark. I closed my eyes, and suddenly I was back there. The smell of dust and diesel fuel, the weight of my pack, the sound of Humvee engines echoing off the mountains. 24 young Marines counting on me to bring them home. Intel was wrong, Richardson said. We walked straight into an ambush. 50 Taliban fighters positioned in the rocks above us. RPGs, automatic weapons, the works. They had us pinned down in a kill zone with no cover except for a dried-up riverbed. Marvin was staring at Richardson like he was speaking a foreign language. This world of combat and sacrifice was as alien to my son as the surface of the moon. We lost radio contact, Richardson continued. No way to call for backup, no way to call for extraction. Half the unit was wounded in the first 30 seconds. We were going to die in that riverbed, picked off one by one until there was nobody left to tell the story. I opened my eyes and found myself looking directly at Marvin. For the first time since his tirade began, he was really looking at me, not through me, not around me, but at me. That's when your father did something I still can't believe. 23 years later, Richardson's voice dropped to almost a whisper. But in the silence of the ballroom, every word carried clearly. He stood up. In the middle of that kill zone, with bullets flying everywhere, Sergeant Kenneth Walsh stood up and started giving orders. The memory crashed over me like a wave, the weight of command, the knowledge that 23 lives hung in the balance. Tommy Martinez bleeding from a gut shot, crying for his mother. Billy Chen with shrapnel in his leg, trying to crawl to better cover. Jimmy Richardson, barely more than a boy, with terror in his eyes and his rifle shaking in his hands. He organized a fighting retreat, Richardson said, created covering fire, coordinated movement, carried the wounded. For 6 hours he held that unit together while Taliban fighters tried to overrun our position. Dad? Marvin's voice was small, uncertain. I looked at my son, this stranger in an expensive tuxedo, and for a moment I saw the little boy who used to ask me to tell him bedtime stories about brave soldiers and heroes. When the helicopters finally found us, Richardson continued, 23 Marines walked onto those birds alive. All of us. Not one KIA, not one left behind. And you know why? He stepped closer to Marvin, close enough that my son had to tilt his head back to meet his gaze. Because your father carried us. Literally carried some of us. Tommy Martinez had lost so much blood he couldn't walk. Your father threw him over his shoulder and ran 100 yards under enemy fire to get him to the extraction point. I remembered Tommy's weight against my back, the sound of his labored breathing in my ear, the wet warmth of his blood soaking through my uniform. I remembered the burn in my lungs, the scream of bullets overhead, the absolute certainty that we were both going to die. He took shrapnel in his shoulder and his leg, Richardson said. Kept fighting anyway. Kept leading, kept saving lives. The scars, the aches when it rained, the nightmares that still came sometimes, 23 years later. Marvin had grown up seeing the physical reminders of that day, but he'd never known what they meant. The bronze star with V device, Richardson said, reaching out and gently touching the metal on my chest. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an enemy of the United States. The Purple Heart for wounds received in combat. The Combat Action Badge for active participation in ground combat. Marvin was staring at the medals now, seeing them for the first time. Really seeing them. Your father, Richardson said, turning back to Marvin with ice in his voice, is a genuine American hero. And you just called him pathetic and punched him in the face. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the weight of 300 pairs of eyes. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman started crying, and Marvin, my son, the boy I'd raised and loved and sacrificed everything for, looked at me with something I'd never seen in his eyes before. Fear. The fear in Marvin's eyes wasn't what broke my heart. It was the recognition that came after it. The slow, dawning realization that he was looking at a stranger. "Dad," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the murmur of 300 guests processing what they'd just heard. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I opened my mouth to answer, but Richardson wasn't finished. His steel-gray eyes had never left Marvin's face, and there was something predatory in his expression now, like a hunter who'd finally cornered his prey. "There's more," Richardson said quietly. "A lot more." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling through what looked like a long list of contacts. When he found what he was looking for, he held the screen up so Marvin could see it clearly. "Kenneth Walsh," Richardson read from the screen. "Emergency contact for Richardson Industries. Listed as closest living relative in my will and testament." Marvin's face went white. "What are you talking about?" "Your father saved 23 lives that day in Kandahar," Richardson said, sliding his phone back into his pocket. "But what he doesn't know, what I never told him, is that one of those lives belonged to the sole heir of Richardson Industries." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. I felt my knees go weak. "My grandfather started Richardson Industries in 1947, Richardson continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a eulogy. "Built it from nothing into a $2 billion empire. Defense contracts, technology development, private military consulting. When my parents died in a car accident, I was the only heir left. I was starting to understand, and the understanding made me sick to my stomach. If I had died in that riverbed in Afghanistan," Richardson said, "Richardson Industries would have been dissolved. 18,000 employees would have lost their jobs. Billions in government contracts would have been terminated. An entire industrial legacy would have been erased." Marvin was shaking his head slowly, like he was trying to wake up from a nightmare. "But I didn't die," Richardson continued, "because Sergeant Kenneth Walsh threw me over his shoulder and carried me 200 yards through enemy fire, because he tourniqueted my leg when I was bleeding out, because he sat with me in that field hospital and told me jokes to keep me conscious while the medics worked on me." The memory came flooding back. Jimmy Richardson, 19 years old, pale as death from blood loss, gripping my hand so tightly I thought he'd break my fingers. He'd been delirious from pain medication, babbling about his grandfather's company, about responsibility he wasn't ready for. So when I inherited Richardson Industries 6 months later, Richardson said, I made a decision. I would use every resource at my disposal to ensure that Kenneth Walsh never wanted for anything, that his family would be taken care of no matter what. My chest felt tight. "Jimmy, what are you saying?" Richardson's gaze shifted to me, and for a moment, the predator mask slipped away. I saw the 19-year-old Marine again, scared and grateful, and determined never to forget. "I'm saying that every major contract your son's company has ever won came through Richardson Industries subsidiaries. Every major investor who backed his startup was someone I personally vouched for. Every business connection that made him successful was a connection I facilitated." The ballroom was completely silent now. Marvin looked like he'd been struck by lightning. "The Peterson Group, who gave you your first major contract," Richardson continued, ticking off names on his fingers. "Richardson subsidiary, Blackstone Capital, who provided your Series A funding. I sit on their board. Morrison Tech, your biggest client. We own 30% of their stock." Marvin's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "For 15 years, Richardson said, I have been quietly, carefully, invisibly ensuring that Kenneth Walsh's son had every opportunity to succeed. Not because you deserved it, but because your father earned it with his blood in a dried-up riverbed in Afghanistan." I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. All those years of watching Marvin build his business, feeling proud of his achievements, his independence. All those times he'd brushed off my congratulations, telling me he'd done it all himself, that he didn't need my help or approval. "Marvin," I said quietly, "did you know about any of this?" My son's face was ashen. No, I swear I didn't know. I thought I built it myself. He trailed off, staring at his hands like he'd never seen them before. "The $5 million investment from Apex Ventures last year?" Richardson pressed on, relentless. "I made one phone call. The government contract that saved your company from bankruptcy 2 years ago. My recommendation carried it through the approval process." Melissa had gone completely still beside Marvin, her champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips. Around us, the wedding guests were starting to process what they were hearing. that the young CEO they'd all been congratulating tonight was essentially Richardson Industries' charity case. "But here's the thing," Richardson said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried clearly across the silent ballroom. "I didn't do any of this for you, Marvin. I did it for him." He pointed at me, and suddenly 300 pairs of eyes were looking at me again. But this time, it wasn't with pity or embarrassment. It was with something I'd never experienced before in my son's world: respect. "Your father never asked for anything," Richardson continued. "Never tried to contact me after Afghanistan. Never tried to leverage our connection for personal gain. He didn't even know I owned Richardson Industries until 5 minutes ago. For 23 years, he's lived quietly, modestly, proud of his son's success and never knowing that success was built on his own sacrifice." Marvin was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he stared at me. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." "But you should have known," Richardson said coldly. "You should have asked. You should have cared enough about your father to learn who he really was instead of dismissing him as some washed-up has-been." I wanted to defend Marvin, to tell Richardson that it wasn't entirely his fault, that I'd hidden my service record, that I'd downplayed my achievements, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down, I knew Richardson was right. Marvin had never asked about my service because he'd never cared enough to ask. "Mr. Richardson," Melissa spoke for the first time since the confrontation began, her voice shaky. "What? What does this mean for the company?" Richardson turned to look at her, and his expression was arctic. "What do you think it means?" The implication hung in the air like a death sentence. Without Richardson's invisible support, Marvin's company was built on sand, and Richardson looked like a man who was done playing guardian angel to an ungrateful beneficiary. "Please," Marvin whispered, reaching toward me with trembling hands. "Dad, please, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. Not because I'd never known who he was, but because he'd never known who I was. And worse, he'd never cared enough to find out. "Marvin," I said quietly, touching the split lip he'd given me, "I need to think about this." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 32 years of disappointment. Richardson nodded approvingly, like I'd just passed some kind of test, but as I looked around the ballroom at 300 shocked faces, I realized the real test was just beginning. The aftermath of Richardson's revelation rippled through the ballroom like an earthquake, and I watched my son's world crumble in real time. It started with whispers, guests turning to each other, voices low but urgent, processing what they'd just witnessed. A CEO attacking his war hero father, a business empire built on secret charity, a wedding that had become a public execution. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richardson's voice cut through the murmur like a commanding officer addressing his troops, "I think it's time we all gave the Walsh family some privacy." But privacy was the last thing anyone wanted to give us. Phones were already out, recording, taking pictures. In the age of social media, Marvin's humiliation would be viral within hours. I could see him realizing this, watching his carefully crafted public image dissolve before his eyes. "Mr. Richardson," Melissa stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Surely we can discuss this privately. There's no need to." "To what?" Richardson's laugh was cold. "To air dirty laundry in public? Your husband already took care of that when he decided to assault a Medal of Honor recipient at his own wedding." "Bronze Star," I corrected quietly. "Not Medal of Honor." Richardson's expression softened slightly when he looked at me. "Sergeant, with all due respect, what you did that day in Kandahar earned you a lot more than what you got. Politics and paperwork don't always catch up with heroism." Marvin was standing frozen in the center of it all, his perfect tuxedo wrinkled, his face streaked with tears and shame. The confident CEO who'd started this evening on top of the world now looked like a lost child. "Dad," he whispered, taking a hesitant step toward me. "Please. Can we talk? Alone?" I studied my son's face, looking for something genuine beneath the panic. "What would you like to talk about, Marvin? I want to understand. I want to know about Afghanistan, about what you did. I want to know about you." The words should have filled me with hope. For 32 years, I'd waited for my son to ask about my service, to show interest in the part of my life that had shaped me most profoundly. But hearing it now, in this moment, with his business empire hanging in the balance, it felt hollow. You want to know about me, I repeated slowly, now that you've learned I'm the reason for your success. Marvin flinched like I'd slapped him. That's not why I'm asking, isn't it? The question hung between us like a challenge. Around us, the ballroom was slowly emptying as guests made their excuses and fled the scene. But the core players remained. Richardson watching like a judge, Melissa clutching her bouquet like a life preserver, and my son struggling to find words that might undo the damage he'd done. I know how this looks, Marvin said finally. I know you think I only care now because of the business implications. But Dad, seeing those medals, hearing what Mr. Richardson said, I realize I never really knew you at all. No, I agreed quietly. You didn't. And that's my fault. I should have asked. I should have cared enough to ask. It was the first honest thing he'd said all evening, and it cut deeper than his fists had. Why didn't you tell me? Marvin pressed on, desperation creeping into his voice. About Afghanistan? About saving lives? About being a hero? Why did you let me think you were just ordinary? The question I'd been dreading. The one I'd asked myself 1,000 times over the years. Because I wanted you to love me for who I was as your father, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Not for what I'd done in a war zone. I wanted to be enough just as myself. The admission hung in the air between us, raw and painful. Marvin's face crumpled. You were enough, he said, tears streaming down his cheeks. You were always enough. I was just too selfish and stupid to see it. Richardson cleared his throat. This is all very touching, but there's still the matter of your company, Marvin. The business, of course. Even in this moment of potential reconciliation, the practical reality couldn't be ignored. Marvin's success, his reputation, his financial empire, all of it hanging by a thread that Richardson controlled. Please, Marvin turned to Richardson, his voice breaking. I know I don't deserve it, but don't punish my employees for my mistakes. Don't destroy the company because I was an idiot. Richardson studied him for a long moment. Your company employs how many people? 437, Marvin answered immediately. 437 families depending on your leadership, Richardson mused. Families with mortgages, children, dreams. And you're asking me to consider their welfare when you couldn't even show basic respect to the man who made it all possible. Marvin's shoulders sagged. You're right. I don't have any right to ask, but they don't deserve to suffer because of what I did. No, Richardson agreed. They don't. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Patricia? Yes, it's James. I need you to draft a formal withdrawal notice for all Richardson Industries contracts with Walsh Enterprises, effective immediately. He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. I don't care what time it is. Get legal on it now. Marvin swayed on his feet like he'd been punched. Mr. Richardson, please. I'm not finished. Richardson cut him off, still speaking into the phone. Also draft an acquisition offer for Walsh Enterprises. We'll absorb their employees, honor their benefits, and complete their existing contracts under the Richardson umbrella. Another pause. Yes, a complete buyout. Market value plus 20% for goodwill. The phone call ended, and Richardson slipped the device back into his pocket. Marvin was staring at him with a mixture of confusion and terror. What does that mean? Melissa asked, her voice small. It means, Richardson said calmly, that as of tomorrow morning, Walsh Enterprises will cease to exist as an independent company. Its assets, contracts, and employees will be absorbed into Richardson Industries. And me? Marvin whispered. Richardson's expression was granite hard. You'll receive fair market value for your shares plus 20%. Consider it a very generous severance package. But the company, my company, was never really yours to begin with, Richardson finished. It was built on charity you didn't know you were receiving, sustained by connections you didn't earn, and successful because of sacrifices you never acknowledged. The final blow. Marvin's legs gave out, and he sank into a nearby chair, his head in his hands. There is one alternative, Richardson said after a moment. Marvin's head snapped up, hope flickering in his eyes. You can resign as CEO and accept a position as a mid-level manager in the new organization. $40,000 a year, no stock options, no executive benefits. You'll report to a supervisor, follow orders, and learn what it means to earn your success. 40,000? Melissa's voice was shrill. That's nothing. We have a mortgage, car payments, credit cards. Then you'll learn to live within your means, Richardson replied coolly. the same way Kenneth has been living his entire life. I watched this exchange feeling strangely detached. My son's empire was crumbling, his marriage was probably over, and his comfortable life was evaporating. And I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, no joy. Just a profound emptiness where 32 years of hope used to live. "Dad?" Marvin looked up at me from his chair, his face ravaged. What should I do? It was the first time in my adult life that my son had asked for my advice. The first time he'd looked to me for guidance instead of dismissing me as irrelevant. "I don't know, Marvin," I said honestly. "That's a decision you'll have to make for yourself." "But what would you do? In my position?" I thought about it. Really thought about it. I'd take the manager position. I'd learn humility. I'd work my way back up the right way, through merit instead of charity. Marvin nodded slowly. "And us? You and me?" That was the question I'd been dreading most, the one that would define the rest of both our lives. "I don't know," I said again. I honestly don't know if there's an us to salvage." The words broke something in Marvin's face, but they were the truth, and I was done pretending otherwise. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of my small cabin overlooking Lake Texoma, watching the sunrise paint the water gold. The coffee in my hands was still steaming, and for the first time in decades I had nowhere I needed to be. The cabin wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen just big enough for a man who'd learned to cook for himself. I'd bought it with part of the settlement money Richardson had insisted on giving me, despite my protests that I didn't want payment for doing my duty. "It's not payment for Afghanistan," he'd said when he'd forced the check into my hands. "It's compensation for 23 years of watching your sacrifice go unrecognized." The money had been enough to buy this place outright and live comfortably for the rest of my life. Nothing extravagant, but everything I actually needed. For a man who'd spent 30 years in military housing and the last decade in a cramped apartment, it felt like a mansion. My phone buzzed on the deck railing. A text message from Richardson. "Poker night Thursday, 7 p.m. Don't bring anything but your appetite for losing money." I smiled and typed back, "Roger that, Commander." Jimmy Richardson had become a constant in my life since that night at the wedding. Not just an old battle buddy checking in out of obligation, but a genuine friend. We had dinner once a week, played poker with some of his other veteran friends, and spent long evenings on this same deck talking about everything and nothing. It turned out that carrying someone to safety creates a bond that doesn't fade with time. He'd spent 23 years wondering if I remembered him, if I thought about that day in Afghanistan. I'd spent the same 23 years trying to forget. Now we talked about it openly. The nightmares that still came sometimes, the sounds that made us both jump. The way certain smells could transport us back to that dried-up riverbed in an instant. It helped, having someone who understood without needing explanations. Another text came in, this one from a number I didn't recognize. "Dad, it's Marvin. I know you don't want to talk to me, but I got a promotion at work. Assistant manager now. Thought you might want to know." I stared at the message for a long time. 6 months of silence between us, broken by news of a promotion that probably came with a $5,000 raise and actual responsibilities. In the old world, before the wedding, assistant manager at someone else's company would have been a devastating step down for Marvin. Now it represented something else entirely, earned achievement. I typed back, "Congratulations. That's good news." 3 dots appeared immediately, showing he was typing a response. They disappeared, appeared again, disappeared. Finally, a simple, "Thanks, Dad." It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't forgiveness. It was acknowledgement, which was more than we'd had 6 months ago. The divorce papers had been filed 3 weeks after the wedding. Melissa had lasted exactly as long as it took her to realize that $40,000 a year couldn't support the lifestyle she'd married into. Marvin had signed without contest, giving her the house, the cars, and most of their savings. He was living in a studio apartment now, riding the bus to work, learning what most people figured out in their 20s. Richardson had kept his word about the job. Marvin was earning his promotions through actual work, actual results. No family connections, no invisible helping hands. Just a man learning what his father had always known. That real satisfaction comes from earning what you have. "Morning, Sarge." I turned to find Richardson climbing the steps to my deck, carrying a bag from the local diner and 2 cups of coffee. "You're early," I said. "Couldn't sleep. Figured you might be having the same problem." It was true. Both of us still woke up before dawn most days, a habit ingrained by decades of military routine. We'd learned to make peace with it, to use those quiet morning hours for reflection instead of fighting them. Richardson settled into the chair beside mine and handed me one of the coffee cups. Got a call from my HR department yesterday. Oh? Your son applied for a position in our management training program. Senior level, not entry level. 2-year commitment. Real advancement potential if he proves himself. I raised an eyebrow. And? He didn't mention you once in his application. Didn't try to leverage our connection, didn't even hint that he knew about our history. Applied strictly on his qualifications and work record. That surprised me. The old Marvin would have played every angle, used every connection. What are you going to do? Richardson sipped his coffee thoughtfully. I'm going to let HR handle it like any other application. If his qualifications merit an interview, he'll get one. If not, he won't. No special treatment either way. Fair enough. The question is, Richardson continued, how do you feel about the possibility of him working for my company? I considered it. 6 months ago, the idea would have filled me with dread, the thought of my son and my best friend in the same professional sphere, with all the complications that could bring. Now it just felt like another step in whatever journey we were all taking. I think, I said carefully, that if he earns it, he deserves the opportunity. And if he doesn't earn it, he deserves the rejection. Richardson nodded approvingly. Good answer. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the lake wake up. A pair of eagles circled overhead, hunting for fish in the shallows. In the distance, I could hear the sound of someone starting a boat motor, preparing for a day on the water. Any regrets? Richardson asked suddenly. About what? Walking away. From your son. From trying to fix things. From being the bigger person. I thought about it seriously. Did I regret choosing my own peace over the possibility of reconciliation? Did I regret prioritizing my mental health over family obligation? No, I said finally. For the first time in my life, I'm not responsible for managing someone else's emotions or fixing someone else's mistakes. I'm not walking on eggshells to avoid disappointing anyone. I'm just living. Sounds lonely, sometimes, I admitted. But lonely is better than invisible, and I was invisible for 32 years. Richardson chuckled. You were never invisible to the Marines you saved. No, I agreed, but I couldn't live my whole life in the past. Even a past I was proud of. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Marvin. Dad, I know this is probably too much to ask, but would you maybe want to have coffee sometime? Just to talk? I showed the message to Richardson. He read it and handed the phone back without comment. What do you think? I asked. I think, Richardson said slowly, that coffee is just coffee. It doesn't obligate you to forgive anything or fix anything or be anything other than exactly who you are right now. He was right. Coffee was just coffee. A conversation was just a conversation. It didn't have to lead anywhere or solve anything or restore what had been broken. I typed back, Saturday, 10 a.m., Denny's on Highway 12. The response came immediately. I'll be there. Thank you. I set the phone down and looked out over the lake again. The eagles had found their fish and were soaring back to their nest, breakfast secured for another day. The boat in the distance was moving now, cutting a clean wake through the water. You know what the best part is? I said to Richardson. What's that? If the coffee goes badly, if he disappoints me again, if nothing changes. I paused, feeling the truth of it settle in my chest. I'll still come home to this deck. I'll still have my peace. I'll still have the life I've built for myself. Richardson raised his coffee cup in a toast. To earned peace. To earned peace, I agreed, clinking my cup against his. And for the first time in 61 years, I knew exactly who I was and exactly where I belonged. Not because someone else had validated me or needed me or approved of me, but because I had finally learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't winning someone back. Sometimes it's discovering that you don't need them to be whole. The sun climbed higher, warming my face and painting the world in shades of gold and possibility. I had a friend who understood me, a home that was truly mine, and the quiet satisfaction of a life lived on my own terms. Saturday would bring whatever it brought. But right now, in this moment, I was exactly where I was supposed to be.